Good day. This is John Hill from Janesville Christian Church coming at you with our Bible study lesson from Galatians chapter 2. I've been having issues with internet, so it's been a while, and also timing to get these out here. But we will focus on Galatians chapter 2 right now, verses 1 through 24, and then we will head over to Galatians 3 in another video, which took us to the intro, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 is now available as well for you to print off. So I pray you can do that. We are in chapter 2. Let me just do a quick summary. As Paul continues defending his apostleship, he describes a meeting in Jerusalem 14 years after the one with Peter related in chapter 1 of Galatians. It was prompted by revelation, and Barnabas and Titus went with him to meet those who were of reputation, meaning the elders in the church. The meeting was private, but some false brethren were secretly brought in who sought to demand that Titus, a Gentile, be circumcised. Paul refused, viewing it as an effort to bring them back into bondage from which Christ set them free, that is, from the law. The result of the meeting was that those who seemed to be something, meaning elders, added nothing to Paul. In fact, once they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised had been given to him just as the gospel of the circumcised had been given to Peter, and once James, Cephas, and John perceived the grace that had been given to Paul, he was extended the right hand of fellowship, meaning they basically ordained him that he was legit. They only asked that Paul be mindful of the poor, which is something that Paul was always mindful of. And between Peter and Paul, Peter, who was visiting at first, was willing to eat with the Gentiles, but then when some came from James, the apostles, out of fear, he withdrew himself. Through his influence, the rest of the Jews, even Barnabas, were carried away into hypocrisy. This prompted Paul to withstand Peter to his face and to rebuke him in the presence of all. In the course of his rebuke, Paul stressed that we are all justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Otherwise, Christ died in vain. So we begin here with chapter 2, verse 1. Paul writes that after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went because of the revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. See, there was an issue, right? The Jews were coming in, trying to put the church under the law again, forcing circumcision upon the Gentiles. And so Paul went to the elders 14 years prior to this and spoke to them and pled his case, what he was preaching, to make sure that what he was preaching was right. And of course, it was right. And so he was then, granted ordination, I guess you can call it, to continue preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. He was secretly brought in who got our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. To them, we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. And from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So basically, this uncircumcised, circumcised, eager to do. So basically, this uncircumcised, circumcised is basically Jews and Gentiles. Some are called to speak to the Jews, the circumcised, and some are called, like Peter and Barnabas, to speak to the uncircumcised, the Gentiles. The Gentiles. This is a mark of humility. Paul was willing to be, interviewed and make sure he was preaching the right stuff. Paul went privately so as not to attract attention. He became involved in the decision at the church. The meeting of Jerusalem addressed similar issues to the letter to the Galatian churches. The letter was written following Paul's first missionary journey around the time of the meeting in Acts chapter 15 when he went to the elders. The specific issue of circumcision found in verse 3, this was not part of the gospel. And the example of Titus, a fellow worker with Paul, is mentioned. Note that Timothy was circumcised back in Acts 16. Paul's teaching is clear, but this was a very real issue in the early church. Now, Timothy was circumcised to the circumcised, so he did it to be like them, so he could be a better witness of preaching the gospel. Titus was going to the Gentiles, so he did not need to be circumcised. Circumcision does not bring anything, right? It's a health issue, but as far as God's favor, circumcised, uncircumcised, does not. Verse 4 speaks of false brethren who have brought danger to others. They came in secretly, infiltrating the church to destroy the liberty enjoyed by true Christians. Paul makes a distinction between false brethren and weaker brethren. Right? False brethren are those who come in who are basically wolves in sheep's clothing, right? Trying to pervert the gospel, trying to change the gospel. Weaker brethren are like new Christians, right? Babes in Christ, who are still learning and growing. We have to be careful of the false brethren. Verse 5, we must stand firm for our conscience sake and for the sake of others. Young Christians and young churches could be devastated gospel. You know, there are a lot of churches today who are preaching a watered down gospel, and they're in trouble. You know, Rick Warren years ago, after writing that bestseller, I just lost the name of it now. Goodness gracious. Well, he wrote a bestseller, and he realized after his church has exploded and we're in the thousands that he had a church full of mediocre, lukewarm Christians. And so he repented and he turned his ways, and now the church is on fire with them. So there are some issues we may take different views on, but on key issues, we must stand firm, right? Some churches, don't practice communion every Sunday. I personally, we do it at our church. We feel the apostles did it. Every time they met, they broke bread. So remembering Christ's sacrifice. But breaking bread, not breaking bread, is not a matter of hell, or heaven. The key issues are Jesus Christ, right? Crucified. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. And what he did for us on that cross matters. And it's only through him, period, since Paul had received the message from God. They had. That Paul had a revelation, right? Christ appeared to him. The apostles with him. To the Gentiles, the apostles with the ministry with those such as Titus and Timothy, ministering amongst the Gentiles. Verses 9. Amongst the apostles, although later there was an incident which challenged this unity, they also shared a concern for the poor, right? So the apostles accepted Peter, Paul, once Saul, and that he is one of them, and he was given their blessing. Paul comments that James, Peter, and John were pillars in the church, and it's significant that in this role, these three apostles contributed written parts of the New Testament as well, and they were pillars in the church. So in verses 11 through 14, we see that Paul opposes Peter. Later, Peter came to Antioch. The culture there was different to Jerusalem. In Antioch, there were many Gentiles who had turned to Christ, whilst Jerusalem was mainly Jewish. So Peter had at first eaten with the Gentiles, no problem. He was a preacher of the gospel, a Jewish man who was eating with the Gentiles, and that's no big deal. The culture there was different. But later, he kept apart from them, fearing the Jewish Christians associated with James. This influenced other Christians, including Barnabas. And in response to this, Paul rebukes Peter for his hypocrisy. He was clearly in the wrong. He was a hypocrite. He was not acting in line with the truth of the gospel. Paul uses strong words about Peter's attitude. James and Peter were both guilty here, yet they were two pillars in the church. No man is above fault or error. I am a human being, right? And I'm not above fault or error. I must keep my life in line with Christ and keep my way pure and clean before him as well. Whilst we must respect those in leadership, we must be aware that they remain human. When respected leaders depart from the truth, many others can be influenced. It's a sad time when a preacher is found out for having an adulterous affair. The church is devastated. It hurts. Peter's behavior and example implied a doctrinal position related to the way Christians live. Paul addresses this issue in verses 15 through 21, which we'll get to in a moment. Although Peter had himself left Jewish behavior, as in Acts 10, but here had compelled the Gentiles to follow Jewish behavior. And so Paul rebuked Peter publicly. The young church was under real threat. The situation was serious and had to be addressed quickly. We are confident that Paul had no personal dislike towards Peter, there being a deep mutual respect for each other. Just Paul trying to tell Peter, listen, let your yes be yes, your no be no. And there's nothing wrong with associating with the Gentile Christians, even though you're a Jew, right? Because we're going to see in chapter 3, the end, that we're all one. Greek, Gentile, or Jewish, Gentile, male, female, slave, free, we're all one. We'll get to that in the next study. And then we get into the last section. He says, we ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. But if, in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners, in Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is I who no longer live, but Christ now lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me, gave himself up for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose, or died in vain. So converted Jews had been delivered from the necessity of following the law, Jewish regulations. This had included both Paul and Peter. The agreed message was and is justification by faith, and Abraham's our example we're going to see in chapter 3. This is true in our experience, for we have put our faith in Jesus Christ and have been justified by faith. And this is true as a matter of fact and principle, that a man is justified by faith in Jesus Christ. In contrast, no flesh can be justified by works or by observing the law. This human way of religion cannot bring about spiritual salvation. We are not saved by our works. The message of justification by faith can be corrupted by corrupt human thinking. What happens if a person who has put faith in Christ then falls into sin? Does that mean that Christ promotes sin? No. The true message does not promote sin. And through faith, we receive power to depart from sin. Paul says many times that grace is not a license to sin. People, and it cannot work for us today. We have died to the law, right? Christ came to fulfill the law, not to change it. Just as we have died to sin, we are free from sin and free from the law that we might live for God. So our daily living, like conversion to Christ, is by faith. Later, Paul addresses this further issue in Galatians 3:3, which we're going to get to next chapter. Since Christ lives in me, I can live constantly by faith in him, and I can display his character. My relationship with him is from his grace and initiative, since he loved me and gave himself up for me. And so the last verse, 21, legalism attacks the gospel. Legalism has no part of the gospel. The grace of God is set aside as irrelevant, and Christ died in vain if legalism takes over, if legalism is the way to God. And the way to God, and it's not the way to God, right? It's not through legalism. Since the grace of God and the death of Christ are central aspects of the gospel, that we must reject this legalism, this way of living, this law that they speak of. So let me quickly go over the questions for chapter 2. This chapter is split up into two main points: the meeting at Jerusalem and the confrontation at Antioch. And then question 2 says, how long was it before Paul returned to Jerusalem. And who sent with him? It was 14 years, and Barnabas and Titus were with him. What prompted him to go? It was revelation from God. And what did he do there? He communicated to those of reputation, those elders of the gospel that he preached among the Gentiles. Question 4. What if some who were secretly brought into this did not submit? Question 5. How do you reconcile Paul's refusal to circumcision of Titus with the fact that Paul later had Timothy circumcised? Circumcision of a Jewish Christian as a matter of expediency was permissible, but circumcision imposed upon a Gentile as an element necessary for salvation was not essential. Question 6. When did those who seemed to be something add to Paul? And they added nothing. What two things prompted them to extend the right hand of fellowship? Well, they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised had been committed to Paul, just as the gospel to circumcised was to Peter. And when James, Cephas, and John perceived the grace that had been with him, gave him that right hand of fellowship, that ordination, you can say. Question 8, what was the only thing they asked of Paul? And that was to remember the poor, to look after them. Number 9, when